Welcome everyone, this is On Just Restart, and this time we're talking about when exactly we could be seeing the release for the sequel to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild sometime in 2022. We got confirmation that Nintendo is aiming for the game to release sometime in 2022, but when exactly? Could it be March 2022? Could it be summer 2022? Will it be holiday 2022? And is there a possibility that the game could be delayed further and not come out until, say, 2023? That's what we're talking about today, trying to come up with a decent idea of when to maybe expect Breath of the Wild 2, because right now, all we know is 2022. So that's what we're talking about today. Now, before we jump into things, let me very quickly talk about my social media. You may see a few different things here on screen. You can check that all out. It is linked in the description below. And of course, if you like what you're seeing here, you can subscribe. So recently we got news that the sequel to Horizon Zero Dawn, Horizon Forbidden West, won't be coming out until early 2022. This game was initially slated for this year, 2021. And what's interesting about that is that the initial Horizon game, Horizon Zero Dawn, came out back in February of 2017. Breath of the Wild came out about a week later, March of 2017, early March. And the games were compared quite a bit back then. Both open world games, one a big deal for Sony, one a big deal for Nintendo, and they made some waves. Breath of the Wild, as many of you know, went on to win more Game of the Year awards than pretty much any game ever. It's been considered an incredible success, the best-selling Zelda game of all time, and it's not even close. The game is super successful, but Horizon also saw some success as well. But there are a lot of comparisons is the point. So much so that a lot of people feel like Horizon sort of paled by comparison because it came out so soon to Breath of the Wild. It didn't get quite the spotlight it deserved. So Sony seems to be perhaps somewhat careful of their release timing for Horizon Forbidden West this time around. They may not want it to come out close to Breath of the Wild 2, but now that Horizon's been delayed until next year, it's now in the same actual release year as the sequel to Breath of the Wild. So then how close will they be? Well, a lot of people have been sort of alluding to the idea that they may sort of come out close together again. And if that's the case, does that suggest that maybe Breath of the Wild 2 is coming out March of 2022? There have been some insiders joking around about the possibility, but no one has come right out and said that Breath of the Wild 2 will be coming out immediately after Horizon Forbidden West, just the same way it happened back in 2017. But could it happen? Could we see Breath of the Wild 2 come out, say, March of 2022 to close out Nintendo's fiscal year? If you don't know, Nintendo's fiscal years end in March, and that's kind of like the final moment, final opportunity for Nintendo to push some pretty big sales so they can appeal to their investors later on. So usually we see some sort of major release by that point. We saw Monster Hunter Rise, we saw Animal Crossing New Horizons, we saw Breath of the Wild on the Switch back in 2017. So there is a little bit of a pattern here of us seeing some sort of major release. And Breath of the Wild 2 has been in development since the end of 2017. So this game surely is quite far along. It is reusing the base foundational engine of Breath of the Wild. It is a sequel. There have been a lot of story things done. All signs are pointing toward this game being very, very far along, and it's been quite some time. It's now 2021, and we're talking about this game coming out probably at least 5 years after the release for Breath of the Wild, potentially later. But the point is, conceivably, the game could come out March of 2022. But I haven't really been thinking that. It's certainly possible. It could be the case that Nintendo just hasn't really felt like showing off too much of the game because they wanted to focus on Skyward Sword HD first and they want to take away too much attention from it. But based off what we've seen so far, I don't really feel like the game is really being positioned as that big fiscal year ending game. Why? Well, if we go to E3, we didn't get much of a blowout of the game at all. We got another trailer. We have 2 trailers of the game, and that's pretty much it. We haven't had an entire big E3 Direct presentation to showcase what this game is all about, all the new gameplay options and possibilities, the expansiveness of the world, and the big draw this time around. It could be the sky, they could be hinting at that with the trailer, but normally the E3 before Big Zelda release is when we see a big blowout of that game and what it can do. We didn't get that this time around. There was nothing for Breath of the Wild 2 at the treehouse. the treehouse being where we usually see a lot of gameplay for different Nintendo games. So we just haven't gotten a lot of details about Breath of the Wild 2 yet. So because we haven't gotten that much information, I don't feel like we're that close to its release. But just because it didn't happen at E3 doesn't mean we can't get a blowout of Breath of the Wild 2 sometime this year. The September Nintendo Direct is approaching. Now, I'm assuming that there will be a September Nintendo Direct. We do not know that for sure, but history suggests that there will be a Direct of some kind in September because that's the way it's been the last 4 or 5 years. So likely we will see another Direct, and potentially there we do see Breath of the Wild 2. That could be the case. We get another trailer there. Maybe they even say, hey, we're going to have a treehouse event a little bit later on where you get to see a whole bunch of gameplay for this game. And that could be the beginning of the big marketing push for Breath of the Wild 2 leading into March of 2022. It is a possibility it could happen. But again, based off how much they showed off at E3, I am skeptical of that because, like I said before, normally we get big gameplay blowouts at the E3 before that Zelda's release. And it didn't happen this time around. But on top of that, the way it was sort of worded, Eiji Aonuma said that they were aiming towards a 2022 release. So that to me doesn't say with 100% certainty that they're going to be able to get it out early into the year. It's almost suggesting that there's a chance that it may be pushed until the next year. So if the game was going to be ready for early 2022, they would have said something with a little bit more confidence, I would say. Perhaps you could argue that they're simply being humble or being careful and they don't want to really build up expectations here. They want to surprise us when they know they're for sure ready. That is possible, but I just feel like what's more likely at this point, given the amount of things that they didn't show and given COVID and the whole big pandemic and the delays that inevitably caused, and the fact that they didn't say it with extreme confidence that it was coming out in 2022, that doesn't bode well for an early 2022 release. But people will stick to the idea that there needs to be something big coming out in March. And I agree, there's a good chance something big will be coming out in March, but I don't think it's going to be Zelda. Keep in mind, Pokemon Legends Arceus, a heavily Breath of the Wild inspired open world Pokemon game, is coming out late January. So if it's coming out late January, isn't that a bit of a small window between that and, say, Breath of the Wild 2? Maybe they want something that's a little bit different, that isn't clearly similar to Pokemon Legends Arceus. Legends Arceus is clearly inspired by Breath of the Wild, so maybe having them separated a little bit might make a bit of sense. And maybe you could even argue maybe we don't even see a big sort of fiscal year ending game coming out in March because of Legends Arceus. Maybe they come out with something a little bit smaller instead. That is a possibility. They don't have to have a really big 10+ million selling game to come out in March. But I still feel like they could. So what would that be? Well, right now, my big bet is Splatoon 3. They showed off Splatoon 3 back in the beginning of the year for the February Nintendo Direct, but when they showed it off, it was interesting because it was so early to the year, yet they already gave us a release year for the next year, and there was quite a bit shown off. They showed off a hub world, they showed off customization options, presumably the beginning of the game, they showed off what appeared to be the single player, they even showed off like actual online play. It seemed pretty far along. So perhaps 13 months later, the game will be ready to release. I think that's a possibility. And if I had to bet, I feel like Splatoon 3 is the more likely of the two games to come out for March of 2022, but potentially neither of them will be happening. But when will we know what's coming out for March of 2022? Well, I feel like we're gonna have a really good idea come September with that supposed Nintendo Direct. Typically during the September Nintendo Direct, they sort of further convey more information about the games to come out throughout the holiday, but they also start to piece together the next year, the following year, and we usually have a decent idea of what's to come in the early months of that year. They're not going to announce all of their earlier releases in January, they're going to announce it a little bit before then. We already know about Legends Arceus, but what about other games like, for example, Mario Rabbids Sparks of Hope, maybe a new Kirby game, maybe a new Donkey Kong game, maybe this Splatoon 3, maybe Breath of the Wild 2. These are all potential options for an earlier release, so we're probably going to start to get some details to sort of fill up the early months of 2022. So if Breath of the Wild 2 is coming out for March of 2022, I strongly believe we will be seeing details on this game during this direct, and maybe they do give us treehouse footage afterwards to share with us a whole bunch of new information on the game, including gameplay. But I don't think it's coming out March of 2022, so I'm gonna assume that we may not see anything for Breath of the Wild 2 in the direct. They may give us another little teaser, another little trailer. That could happen. But they also may not say anything until, say, for example, the Game Awards later this year, or perhaps an earlier Nintendo Direct next year, perhaps next February. But conceivably, we don't even get any updates for Breath of the Wild 2 all the way until E3 of 2022. June 2022, maybe the next time we see actual details for the sequel to Breath of the Wild. I could see it happening sooner, but it really could take that long. But I think by this point, June 2022, we will get a big blowout for this sequel, and we're going to learn all about this game. It's going to be similar to what we got for E3 2016 with Breath of the Wild 1, and they're going to give us a hard release date at that point, and I'm going to assume that it's actually going to be a holiday release. Conceivably, Breath of the Wild 2 could come out, say, for example, summer, and if that's the case, maybe we do get like a blowout in early 2022, but I'm thinking most likely this is really being positioned as a big holiday release. It's looking like Nintendo definitely had to deal with some delays because of the pandemic, but also they're being really ambitious with this game, and they want to do a lot, and they really want to outperform the initial Breath of the Wild, hence the long development cycle. That's what I'm currently thinking right now. There are already a decent amount of games that are going to be coming out next year, and I feel like Breath of the Wild 2 is going to be that game that'll come out maybe October or November. It'll be a huge Game of the Year candidate kind of game. It'll be very exciting, and it's going to be the marquee title for Nintendo's next holiday. It's worth bringing up that a lot of people speculated that Breath of the Wild 2 would come out with some sort of more powerful Switch revision. And I was one of those people. I thought Breath of the Wild 2 and this Switch revision would come out this year. But that didn't happen. Maybe at one point Nintendo was considering releasing a 4K Switch revision alongside Breath of the Wild 2, but that's not the plan they ended up going with. We got Switch OLED, and I don't think we're going to be seeing a more powerful, more expensive Switch revision so soon after the release of another more expensive SKU for the Nintendo Switch. Nintendo waited 2.5 years to release the Switch Lite, and then they waited another 2 years to release Switch OLED. I think if we're going to be seeing another SKU, I don't expect it to be a more expensive one in less than a year from the release of Switch OLED. I just don't see that happening. So I don't really see Breath of the Wild 2 launching alongside another Switch revision this time around. I feel like at this point, we probably should just wait for the next gen Switch. I can see that coming out maybe about 2 or so years from now. And by that point, I'm not saying Switch would be dead. It would just be sort of living alongside this next generation Switch for a couple more years. So Switch probably has at least another 4 years or so before it's completely done, kind of how like the 3DS lived on alongside the Switch for a couple of years. So that's fine, but the point is, I don't see Breath of the Wild 2 being pushed or anything like that for any sort of hardware this time around. If the timing works out, Nintendo will use Zelda to push hardware, but if the timing doesn't work out, then they're not going to do that. They're just going to release the game. And I think Breath of the Wild 2 will for sure be ready by holiday 2022, even though Eiji Aonuma did sound a little humble when suggesting that they were aiming for a 2022 release. I think they're going to hit it, because the game's been in development since 2017. They are using Breath of the Wild as a foundation. Yes, there was the pandemic, but if it wasn't for the pandemic, I think we probably would know a lot more about this game by this point. I think holiday 2022 is a relatively safe bet, but we shall see what happens. If we don't get a whole bunch of news during the September Nintendo Direct, then I would say for sure it's not coming out March of 2022. And if we don't get a whole bunch of news for Breath of the Wild 2 with a release date around January or February of next year, then for sure it's not coming out summer. But we still may get some details before then. I think maybe at the Game Awards we get like some sort of teaser. And then by summer of 2022, E3 will get a big blowout and the game will get a big marketing push and it'll come out holiday 2022. That's what I'm thinking right now, but what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways, everyone, this is On Just Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care.